This series on Wraith 20th Anniversary Edition continues. We now move into Book 2, the middle of this compiled and collected work. And we start with Chapter 7 on storytelling, a chapter that I knew I was going to have difficulty talking about, and I did. Keen-eyed viewers will note this video is more heavily annotated than any other preceding it in the series.
All right, here we are, getting ready to enter Book 2, Chapter 7, which is the storytelling chapter. And this is where we're going to have some more ideological conflict, I guess we could say, as we get into how this book describes the role of the player who takes on the duty of being the storyteller. Right? Now, some of this chapter is just allocated to explaining, the things for which that player will be responsible. But there's more to it than that. Here is where the game is attempting to communicate its concept for how this game is best run. This is direct advice to the player who will take on the role of storyteller, and it's suggested that the other people in the game, those who aren't taking on that specialized role, should also read it in order that they understand what it is that the person who is the storyteller is trying to do. I think that's good advice, especially because I feel for a group to be healthy, for a role-playing group to really be healthy, requires that everybody play and everybody run the game. Everyone is the game master, everyone is the player, and they switch things up and they bring in games that they're interested in, and they alternate the campaigns and chronicles that they participate in, and they give everybody the opportunity and the responsibility of doing things like hosting, planning, coordinating, creating sessions 0 and the like, so that it is a group collaboration, as gets talked about, for real. The person who gets stuck forever in the role of storyteller is missing out on what all the rest of the group gets to enjoy, and all the rest of the group also misses out on what the storyteller is enjoying in their role. So let's go through. Chapter 7, Storytelling, opens up with yet another description of what ghost stories are and how they relate to human activity. It's fine to see it again, particularly because some people are going to go right here directly. It explains to us in its second paragraph that Wraith is an extension of the ghost story tradition, which is another way of saying it's a means of storytelling and that someone has to be the teller of tales. So this is directly telling you that someone is going to be creating stories. Someone has to tell the tale. And it says, to a certain extent, all the players in a Wraith game are storytellers, adding their contributions through their characters and the shadows they control, but the bulk of the work and the responsibility falls on the singular storyteller. This is your first impression and your second impression. This was reinforced earlier in the book of what the storyteller is. Right? Now, if they had stuck to that all the way through, I'd really have no problem with it. There's a significant justification for a setting like this, with the mysteries that it entails and with the exploration of psyche and shadow that makes it what it is. There's a certain amount of sense, practical sense, to running the game with that kind of centralized authority, as we talked about before. But they don't stick to that concept. Then, next paragraph, newcomers to storytelling games may find them a bit different from what they're used to. Wraith, like other role-playing games, rests squarely on a foundation of improvisation. Gameplay consists of the players donning the roles of their characters and then reacting moment to moment to the world and characters the storyteller presents them with. The emphasis is on you to decide your words and actions, and while there are dice rolls to resolve conflicts and determine success or failure, the real heart of the game is the way the characters interact. This sort of storytelling freedom can be exhilarating, daunting, or both simultaneously. Okay. The next section is the storyteller. It's divided up into subsections, right? Using rules and entertainment. And it's putting the onus directly on this one person to be responsible for the fun of the others. This is very commonly printed in games. It's recycled over and over and over again. You are the one who's responsible for making sure that everyone has a good time and no one crosses the line. And it's long past time for that attitude to go away. It is a group activity. Everybody has to show up ready to play. Everybody has to do their best. Everybody's responsible for the fun of everybody else. If someone is there trying to, coddle you or trying to make sure that you specifically are having a good time and that everyone else can take care of themselves, or gee, I sure hope they enjoy the story I've prepared and stuff like this, it leads to many of the problems that they try and fix here. It's time to get past it. Show up, be a good player. Whether you're the GM, the game master, the storyteller in this case, or someone who's there to portray a character. It's not one person's job to make sure everybody has a good time. It's time for this kind of stuff to go away. It talks about play versus fun. It reminds us that Wraith is a game with serious themes. It's a good place for the reminder to be. It's reminding us that the character is to be challenged, not the player. All right? If the player is getting uncomfortable, you're doing something wrong. And by uncomfortable, we're talking about a feeling that they don't want to experience. Not that they're, kind of squeamish about, but that they're telling you no more. And I think that's fair in any particular group. It moves into Wraith storytelling key elements, right? That opens up with, for all the discussion of the theoretical and finer points of storytelling, at the core of things, the role of storyteller is a simple one. To break things down to their simplest level, when play starts, the storyteller sets the scene by describing the scenario to the players and by acting out the roles of the characters in it that aren't controlled by them. Okay? This is not what they talked about before. Elements of Wraith. What are they? Well, there's theme. Hugely important. Well written. They go into a sidebar about props and music, and you can take or leave that as suits your experience. They talk about the different themes. They suggest strong themes, ones that have been known to work before. That's very helpful, like adventure, going out and exploring the underworld, seeking the far shores, daring the dangers of the tempest, and so on and so forth. Defiance, fear, immortality, inner conflict, intrigue. Certainly the society that they've set up for the land of the dead is rife with intrigue, mystery, triumph. Right? These are just some of the suggestions. Then they help you expand on the concept of theme by exploring the idea of mood. Now, sometimes there's these sweeping statements like, you need to create mood, without going into some ways that can happen through the use of language or through the use of what you talk about during the planning sessions when you're building the characters and things like that. But it's not bad, and goes into suggestions, again, strong moods that are maybe easy or suitable to evoke, like romantic or an ominous mood or the tragic mood, again, mysterious, exciting, or lighthearted, like we were talking about in the previous video. It is possible for even something so gloomy as Wraith to be lighthearted. Okay. Now, we move into a quick description, which is important to understand about the difference between fear, terror, and horror. Right? Definitely worth reading, not just for this game, but for other games as well. We get into storytelling tools. Right? It talks about events. These are the things that actually happen. And it puts this in the context of planning events before they happen, and then having to improvise from that. It gets confused on this issue repeatedly, and this is again something that needs to be sorted out. If these games are going to be printed and recycled and kept current, then that's one of the things that has to change to keep them current, is clearer language about what they're actually talking about. There's a purpose. If you're running a chronicle, there should be some underlying purpose that ties into your theme, and it's the reason for the mood. There's the scope and the scale, right, Are we just dealing with this small circle of wraiths, or are we dealing with Wraith society at large? Right? Be aware of these things. Pacing, right? Pacing both in terms of the fiction and how quickly the session moves along. This isn't bad. Storyteller characters is the next tool, friends and allies. Then, here on page 261, there's this huge sidebar that says, it's okay to cheat sometimes. And it talks about fudging dice, it talks about deciding what outcomes are going to be before you even start, it talks about pretending to roll dice, and it says that it's okay because the story is the most important thing, and sometimes you don't want to be bogged down with the system. This is very incoherent evidence. Why have such detailed and complicated systems with all these variable target numbers, with how dice pools are built and how they're evocative of what the character is and what the character knows, all these rules about how to use your willpower, what angst is for, what the pathos, the emotional energy of the Wraith is for, all of these things, all of these complicated ways that things interact each other through the vehicle of the dice. And then say, yeah, but if it gets inconvenient, all right, it's okay to lie, it's okay to cheat, it's okay to make things up or do things differently, just as long as everybody has fun, which often means just as long as nobody knows that you've actually done that. So this sets up a curious relationship in a group of people who are supposed to be friends and who have agreed to play a game. Well, now they're not. Why? The only reason why is to protect a story or a sense of where a story is going or could go, because that would be cool. Right? And then pretending to invoke the dice and lying about the results in order to make it go there. But most of this chapter is saying, hey, yes, you've planned the story, but don't hang on to it too tightly. Be willing to let it go. Improvise, because that's where the tension is, that's where the fun is, that's where the excitement is. But then again, hang on to it really tightly, and so tightly, in fact, that you're willing to lie about what the dice roll is. So that's actually what it's saying. You may not get that impression when you skim through it, but go through it. It's saying, on one hand, improvise. On the other hand, plan. On one hand, roll the dice. This is what the dice mean. On the other hand, lie about the dice or don't use them at all. Just gonna, move past it quickly and hope no one notices. It's bizarre.
Let's step to the side for a moment, and I'll try to clarify something. Beyond the message I'm sending in this video, those who are reading the annotations may be getting the distinct impression that I prefer or have a bias toward the first edition. This isn't actually true. I do think that first edition was better at explaining the differences in modes of play. I think that the writers of it had a clearer sense of the different ways to play than those who followed them. However, as a storyteller and as a player, I was significantly more impressed with Wraith 2nd edition. Now, obviously, this means that I glossed over those parts that didn't gel, or I assumed that they were carried forward. But on close reading, going through Wraith 1st edition, 2nd edition, and now the 20th anniversary edition, we see which parts are clear and which parts aren't, and where they are found. Obviously, the best of these three books in dealing with the actual practical problems of play is Wraith 20th anniversary edition, except on this point. And this is such an important point, and we've been role-playing for such a long time, and Storyteller and the World of Darkness and these games, and this game in particular, were so important in pushing the boundaries of common conception and perception of what role-playing is. It's disappointing to see it falter, to see it fall back on copied text, to see it fall back on simply rewriting the same old stuff without really considering deeply what the text is giving as its impression. And to back up my words, here are direct quotes from all three. Wraith 1st edition.
Do you remember swapping tales around a campfire or at a party, trying to tell the scariest ghost story? Deep inside us all lurks the urge to weave a tale that can scare our friends and ourselves half to death. The urge to fascinate is as deeply embedded as the urge to tell stories, and no subject is more fascinating than a glimpse at our own mortality. Wraith is a storytelling game that allows us to create our own ghost stories, stories in which we play the ghosts. Wraiths, and by extension the game, are metaphors for ourselves. By setting ourselves inside the world of darkness for an evening, we can look into a funhouse mirror that reflects the darkest aspects of our world. The stories to be found here are macabre indeed, but in the end, they are just tales. Ghost tales, if you will. When we press our faces to this ghostly mirror, the reflection we see is still our own. It's distorted, perhaps, but recognizable. The storyteller's job is to hold that mirror before the players and give them a long, scary look.
Wraith, 2nd edition.
Ghost stories are an intrinsic part of the human condition, combining, as they do, two of our strongest drives, fear of death and the need to share our experiences. Part of a time-honored tradition, ghost stories have been handed down from the cavemen to us by way of hands as diverse as Dickens and Homer, Tim Burton, and the author of Beowulf. Wraith is a natural extension of the grand and glorious ghost story tradition, but that means that in Wraith, stories will have to be told, and that someone has to be the teller of tales.
20th Anniversary Edition.
Ghost stories are a deeply human response to the fear of death and the need to share our experiences. Together, those two elements merge to create something new, a way of contextualizing the eternal question of what happens next. The stories that come out of this are part of a time-honored tradition, handed down through the millennia from Homer to Charles Dickens to Toni Morrison, and adapting to the needs of the living along the way. Wraith is an extension of the ghost story tradition, which is another way of saying that it's a means of storytelling, and that someone has to be the teller of tales.
While Wraith 1st edition had a clearer sense that people played in different ways and a clearer sense of what those different ways are, it certainly lacked the experience in preparing storytellers and players alike for exactly what would be required to make sure that the game of Wraith actually happened. Famously, this is a game that very few people played, despite how many people claimed to love it. And so, looking at these 3 quotes, we see the drift from the awareness of collaboration into the requirement of the storyteller overall. This is, I suppose, a natural extension of the development of storyteller as a phenomena, and the sense that hearing that word over and over and over again, you are the storyteller, would have on the writers and players of the game. It's understandable and doesn't make it any less sad or disappointing. So, in the same way, when we look at Wraith 1 telling us about story-driven and character-driven play, we get a completely different understanding than when we look at them in Wraith 2nd and in Wraith 20. Here we see them that story-driven is pushing toward the story that you have planned, and character-driven is pushing the characters toward the story that you have planned. They're not described the same way, they're not meant the same way, but that has become what all the advice tends to be focused around, except in those brief moments when people remember that not everybody plays that way, but they don't have the vocabulary, it seems, to express those differences clearly. And that is a shortcoming. And so, let's return to the video that I've interrupted with how those things don't fit together.
They don't fit together. They shouldn't be together. They could be there as alternate systems, presented separately. They've done that before in the Shadow chapter. Why mash them together here? I suspect it's because the writers don't realize that they're mashing these ideas together, or they're just recycling text from other World of Darkness books. Either way, I'm not too impressed with this antagonistic, conflicting message, which conveniently brings us into the antagonist section. They have a good sidebar on character voice versus character accent and characters staying together. There's a reminder about the setting, right? How to describe the setting, how to bring it to life. Long part on conflict. What are the sources of conflict in Wraith? This is excellent. It's a good reminder. Everything's there quickly. Then it moves into Chronicles. Again, there's some incredible art here. How to start a Chronicle, how to direct it, Chronicle concepts, right? Just so if you're like many people and not sure, out of all the possibilities that have been presented in Book 1, what can I actually do? This does an excellent job of codifying common starting points with the game. Moves into what's the difference between a chronicle and a story. Passions and fetters, both very helpful. Then we get into advanced techniques. Very cool stuff. Flashbacks, foreshadowings, dreams, symbolism, lost memories, unreliable narrators, and then words of advice about crossover games. That's all excellent. Endings. Right? In this game, so important. Endings, we talk about character destruction, chronicle endings, talking about changes in power and the aftermath of a chronicle. You know, when these things end, there should be some import to it. And finally, authority and responsibility. And this goes back to the storyteller being the ultimate authority for whom on whom all entertainment rests and all moral authority resides. And if someone's being a dick in the game, it's on you to make sure they leave and stuff. And I'm sorry, I just cannot agree. And that brings us to the end of this problematic chapter, at least for me, in Wraith 20th Anniversary Edition. It's got a lot of great technical advice, but the point of view it comes from in terms of how to run a game and have a healthy game group is conflicted, and it's something that more people, I think, should be talking about. Okay, next time, Chapter 8.